Mobile Suit Gundam as a franchise has been around for over 40 years now, and while that longevity has made it one of the most iconic names in all of anime and beyond, it also makes it really hard for potentially new fans to find the right entry point. And while there are a few go-to answers longtime fans will suggest to anyone wanting to dip their toes in the metaphorical ocean that is Gundam, ideally you should probably just start by watching the original Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979. But just as a public service announcement, if you do decide to watch First Gundam, for the love of God, please do not watch the compilation movies. If you're going to go all in on this, then you really should just go all in and watch the original series in its entirety. But all that being said, I'm also well aware that in this day and age, watching 42 episodes of a series originally released over 4 decades ago can be a bit too much of a commitment for some right off the bat. Which is why the usual suggestion you'll find as to where you should start your Gundam journey is either 0080 War in the Pockets or the 08th MS Team. And honestly, these are solid choices. Like, you're not going to find me disparaging either of these shows. But at the same time, I also don't know that I'd recommend either of these choices for onboarding new fans, because I don't think they really adequately prepare you for what the rest of Gundam has to offer. The main reason people recommend these two series in the first place is because A, they're short, with 08th MS Team only being 12 episodes and War in the Pocket being even shorter at just 6. B, they're both OVA series, so the animation quality is top-notch. And C, they're self-contained stories with an increased focus on ground-level soldiers instead of a giant, all-encompassing military conflict. And I mean, yeah, those are all reasons why these two shows are great. But the catch here is, at least for the majority of Gundam, that isn't what you're usually going to get. In my mind, part of what makes these OVAs so great is how they contrast from the usual Gundam formula. And while I still think anyone could appreciate either of these suggestions without that broader context, once you're done watching them, you're still kind of left with the same problem that you started with. You still don't have that logical next step that takes you further into the franchise. Thankfully though, I do have an alternative recommendation, albeit possibly a contentious one, that does still fit all of these same bullet points. And so now, my friends, I present to you my case as to why, if you really want to get into Gundam, you should start by watching Mobile Suit Gundam F91. Now before I go into further detail as to why I think F91 is a good starting place for new fans, I should probably give you some background information about how and why F91 came into existence in the first place. As it currently exists, Mobile Suit Gundam F91 is an almost 2-hour-long animated film that originally hit Japanese theaters in the spring of 1991. But that wasn't always what this project was supposed to be. Initially, F91 was intended to be the first television series to be released since Mobile Suit Gundam Double Zeta finished airing in January of 1987. But due to what is usually only vaguely referred to as staff disputes, the series was stalled with only 13 of the scripts being written. But not wanting the existing materials they already had on hand to go to waste, it was ultimately decided the scripts would instead be reworked into the creation of a feature-length film. And if that sounds like a really bad way to go about making a movie, well, you're not wrong. But before we dive deeper into that, I do want to highlight some of F91's strong points, because they do exist, especially as it pertains to introducing a new person to the wider world of Gundam. To start off with, one of the most helpful parts of F91 is the setting, which also means this is probably a good time for me to give you a rough breakdown of what the Universal Century is. Now, while there are at this point a bunch of different timelines and continuities within the larger franchise, the Universal Century is sort of what serves as the backbone for Gundam. And that's mostly because, well, this is where the whole thing started. Beginning with the original Mobile Suit Gundam, which narratively takes place in the year Universal Century 0079, the UC timeline primarily consists of the first 3 mainline Gundam series that aired on Japanese television, as well as the first original film Char's Counterattack, which takes place all the way in the year UC 0093. Now, while Char's Counterattack essentially served as a climax for the first real arc of Gundam, over time, even more series and movies have been added to fill in the gaps in this timeline with prequel origin stories, alternative perspective narratives, as well as some completely new storylines, such as the aforementioned War in the Pocket and the 08th MS Team. So basically, because the UC is such a huge part to the franchise, if you're someone new to Gundam, you're eventually going to have to contend with this particular timeline. But if all of this is starting to look real intimidating to you, don't worry, because almost none of it factors into F91. Although still technically part of the Universal Century, Mobile Suit Gundam F91 takes place in the year UC 123. In other words, 30 years after the events of Char's counterattack. And if 30 years doesn't sound like a lot to you, well, just know it might as well be 300 years with how rarely this film references anything that came before it.
You know, a long time ago there was a mobile suit that had a face like this. You see?
Oh, hey, it was called a Gundam, right?
But regardless of how standalone this film is, I should probably still give you at least some idea about what the basic plot is to this film. So Mobile Suit Gundam F91 takes place in a world where almost all of humanity has moved off of Earth due to excessive pollution, and has begun a new life amongst the stars, living in multiple orbital space colonies under the control of the Earth Federation. We start off on the peaceful colony of Frontier 4, where quiet everyday life is quickly and violently interrupted by a mobile suit invasion from a military group calling themselves the Crossbone Vanguard. Oh yeah, by the way, one of the things Gundam is usually really good at is naming stuff. As civilians start running for safety, we are introduced to our main protagonist, Seabuk Arno, as he and his friends try to make their way to a nearby shelter and evacuate the colony. But as the group finally makes it to the evacuation point, one of Seabuk's friends, Cecily, our other protagonist in the film, is captured by a Vanguard mobile suit. As it turns out, this was part of the true objective for the invasion of Frontier 4 all along, due to the fact that Cecily is actually a secret daughter of the aristocratic Rona family who are in control of the Crossbone Vanguard. After a failed attempt to rescue Cecily, Seabuk and his friends eventually escape, and with Federation forces fully pushed out of the colony, Frontier 4 is renamed Cosmo Babylonia and made the official capital of the Rona family's new independent nation. And so that basically gives us the setup for our central conflict in the movie. And with our two main characters now conveniently split across party lines, we get to see both perspectives of this burgeoning war, which has kind of been one of the big calling cards for the franchise up until this point. In addition to this, some of the other aspects of the film that also function as common Gundam tropes are a villain who hides his face behind some kind of mask, a colony invasion by the enemy faction within the first 20 minutes, rivals/lovers separated by military allegiances, and our protagonists being a group of ragtag fighters made up of mostly children and teenagers. And of course, all of this has to culminate with one of the biggest Gundam tropes of them all. The special boy gets in the big war robot and feels really bad about having to kill people.
The pilots, I just killed them. They're dead. They're dead.
Now, those last 2 points are what I really want to focus in on, and so let's start by taking a closer look at that last clip we just saw. If you've already seen my video covering Evangelion, then you know depicting the trauma of war through these young Gundam pilots has been a staple of the franchise from the very beginning.
I see, so this is what war is!
Like, that is literally from the second episode of Mobile Suit Gundam ever, and F91 takes this idea a step further. For example, the opening of this movie is just absolutely brutal. Make no mistake here, all the action and explosions on screen are not framed as cool or exciting. They're portrayed as horrifying. We see people frantically scramble away in all directions, close shelter doors on their friends and neighbors, run past crying children left unattended in the streets. I don't think I'll ever be able to forget this image of a stray shell casing from a mobile suit striking this woman in the head, killing her instantly and leaving her infant child crying in her arms. Warfare in Gundam isn't presented as a bountiful playground to stage fun action scenes between giant robots. It's a tragedy. The avoidable result brought on by the moral and ethical failings of both politicians and military leaders alike. But all that being said, I don't also want to give you the wrong idea here either. Because while all this heavy anti-war sentiment is pervasive throughout Gundam, it does also have a more lighthearted side as well. Which thankfully segues nicely into looking at the other trope I mentioned earlier, about how the main cast is primarily made up of characters under the age of 18. This is worth pointing out because it highlights something that I think is important for new Gundam fans to reckon with sooner rather than later. And that's the fact that this franchise is, and basically always has been, made to appeal to a younger audience. Like, down to its very core, Gundam has been designed as a vector to sell loads of merchandise to kids, most specifically model kits. And I mean, this is due in no small part to the fact that model kits, also referred to as Gunpla, are basically what saved the franchise in its earliest days. Back in 1979, when the original series was airing on Japanese television, well, to put it frankly, the show wasn't really doing very well. In fact, the ratings were so bad that the show's sponsors cut the originally planned 52-episode run down to just 39 installments. Eventually, the producers did manage to negotiate that number back up to 43, as to give them the runway they needed to properly conclude the series for what, at the time, seemed like forever. But due to the first line of Gunpla being released by Bandai in the following summer, Gundam's popularity began to grow exponentially, and coincided with the show's rating skyrocketing even though it was already now well into reruns. So in turn, this is why you have creative decisions being made, such as the mobile suits in F91 being designed in a smaller scale, because it was believed that that would make the eventual model kits easier to pose in dioramas with equally scaled human figures. So creating a product that appeals to consumers is just as much a fundamental element to this franchise as anything else, which does have the unfortunate side effect of undercutting a lot of those heartfelt anti-war aspirations we mentioned a moment ago. Because on one hand, you have these gigantic machines that are supposed to be viewed as terrifying weapons of war, but they also need to be designed to sell officially licensed merchandise as well. They need to look aesthetically pleasing. Like, in some regard, you're supposed to watch this movie and think, man, that mobile suit looks so cool, I can't wait to go buy the model kit and spend the better part of an afternoon building that damn thing. So yeah, Gundam is, even at the best of times, truly a land of contrasts. And if you're going to try and get into this franchise, no matter where you choose to start, this particular brand of narrative dissonance is just something you're going to have to try and learn to live with. But you know, that might actually be easier than it sounds. Because all things being equal, this contradiction is probably my favorite aspect to Gundam overall. Here, let me try and put a finer point on it. Okay, so I know for a lot of people, this is going to sound like the opposite of a selling point, but when Gundam is really on its A game, it's a lot like the Star Wars prequels. Alright, wait, let me clarify that. It's a lot like the Star Wars prequels, but if they were good. Like, one of the most common complaints about the prequels, especially episode 1, is that George Lucas keeps insisting these are just fun movies made for kids, and yet they're also loaded with tons of dry political minutia as well. And so because of this, you get a movie that opens with our two protagonists on a mission to investigate an intergalactic trade dispute, and an hour later we're watching a cartoon rabbit stepping in a pile of alien poop. And while Gundam does often try to walk this same tonal tightrope, it also proves that if you do it right, this isn't necessarily a flawed formula to follow. To me, one of the biggest reasons the prequels stumble over this roadblock is that the general ideologies of the Jedi and the Sith don't really map onto the political conflicts Lucas wants to comment on very well. Which in turn is why most of the villains in these movies are either aliens whose only characteristics are thinly veiled racist stereotypes, or straight up evil people who just love being evil. And look, I'm not trying to say that Gundam hasn't at times stepped on a lot of these same allegorical landmines. But like I said, when these stories are operating at peak performance, I actually think they do a pretty good job of striking that correct balance. And in my opinion, F91 is a great example of this. For instance, one of the best things about the movie's compressed runtime is it doesn't have to waste any time pretending like the Earth Federation are actually the good guys here. This is something a lot of the longer running series eventually get around to, but usually we have to wait at least like 20 episodes before it's revealed that the particular side our heroes are aligned with may not actually have their best interests at heart. But in F91, we instead introduce this idea within the first 20 minutes. In that opening scene where the Federation and Vanguard combatants are fighting it out inside of Frontier 4, it's arguably the good guys that account for more civilian casualties here than the villains do. Like, remember this horrific scene from earlier with the woman getting struck on the head? That shell casing is actually coming off of a Federation mobile suit, not the enemy. On top of all this, at one point in the battle, Federation forces just go and blow a dang hole in the side of the colony, potentially venting dozens if not hundreds of innocent people into the cold vacuum of space. While on the other side, the crossbow mobile suits are primarily relying on their shot lancers, a weapon specifically designed to minimize damage while fighting within a space colony. And this contrast in tactics eventually crescendos when Seabook and company are making their way to the evacuation point, and they run into a particularly craven Federation officer who wants to use them as human shields.
Hey, can we get through?
Perfect. It's okay, we'll use them. If you came to fight, we could use a hand right now.
Wait a second, we just want to get over to Pier 24, and that's all. Hang on, everyone, I'm backing up.
They'll never attack us if we can use the children as living shields! Stop that!
Now, to be clear, the whole point to this subversion is not to say 'tis actually the good guys who are bad, and the bad guys who aren't good. No, the revelation here is that both sides suck, just for different reasons. Like, yes, when the Crossbone Vanguard are invading Frontier 4, they are making a concerted effort to limit civilian casualties as much as possible. But don't confuse this for an act of altruism. After all, it's important to remember that the Vanguard is the military force pledged to serve the Rona family, who are a bunch of aristocratic monarchists.
But doesn't this Cosmo aristocracy that you advocate also produce discrimination?
Justifiably. The Highborn have duties they must fulfill no matter what. I believe that humankind and the world should be ruled by the Highborn, by those who are not afraid to spill their blood in defense of an ideal and who cherish honor.
So yeah, definitely not the good guys here either. But although the Rona's ultimate solution may be flawed, they aren't wrong about the underlying problem, because the Earth Federation is absolutely an institution worth rebelling against. In addition to all the general incompetence and outright indifference towards the well-being of the citizens they're supposed to be protecting, in the aftermath of the attack on Frontier 4, it's revealed that the Federation's top brass have retreated back to Earth, and don't really seem all that concerned about the threat that the Rona family's rebellion poses to the everyday people of their colonies. In fact, any military operation we do see from the Federation's point of view seems only to be motivated by pride, revenge, and a desire to retain valuable resources. And I think this approach to building factions is a real strength of especially UC-era Gundam. But at the same time, if you're more than a little bit wary of this particular dichotomy because it feels like it could very easily devolve into just another rote both-sidesism kind of narrative that doesn't really wind up taking a position one way or the other, well, I'll say that's certainly a fair concern to have. And I'm not going to try and make the case that every series in the franchise always pays off these weighty setups with adequate resolutions, because, honestly, they rarely do. But the one thing that I really do appreciate about how Gundam handles these particular scenarios is it hardly ever uses this lack of a purely righteous side of the conflict as an excuse to not fight at all. Depending on where your own personal politics lie, you still might bristle at some of these specific reasons as to why most Gundam protagonists decide to fight, and Seabook is no exception to this. But thankfully, these shows and movies are usually pretty good about getting their central characters to a place where fighting the good fight is still a worthwhile endeavor. They'll freely acknowledge that, no, it isn't fair that the Federation is relying on a group of child soldiers to bear the largest cost in their many, many wars. But they're also still more than willing to use the Federation's assets to fight for what they believe in. And I don't know, I guess in the year 2020 there's still just something kind of relatable about a group of young people fighting for stronger actionable power within a much larger political party that is technically the lesser of two evils, but is still nonetheless under the control of a much older generation that has been calcified and corrupted by their own self-interest and don't legitimately care about the concerns or needs of the younger generation that's going to inherit all the consequences for their many mistakes. But I'm just speaking metaphorically here, of course. So if it wasn't already obvious to you, for a franchise that partially exists solely to sell toys to children, there's actually a surprising amount of thematic nuance that you can dig into, if you want to do that work. And I understand it can be jarring for some to watch a movie that is this devoted to ideological differences and the tragedy of war, that also has multiple scenes of physical slapstick comedy involving children. But in the end, it's really these two competing forces that makes Gundam so compelling to me. Like, I honestly find it kind of endearing that it wants to be this franchise that is squarely aimed at kids, but it also wants to tell them that war isn't cool and that most adults are just self-centered assholes who will almost always choose to protect themselves first and you second. And so now with that lengthy explanation out of the way, hopefully that Star Wars comparison I made earlier also makes a lot more sense now. Plus, hey, do you guys like the Imperial March? Well, too bad, because it's definitely not in this movie. Alright, so before we wrap all this up, I'd be remiss if I didn't also comment on a few of the film's shortcomings. Because, they do exist. Fine, I'll just come clean here and say the pacing to this film is an utter mess. As it turns out, trying to compress what was initially supposed to be 13 episodes of a TV show down into a tight 2-hour film is a bit of a challenge, which basically means F91 just tries to jam in way more plot than its runtime could ever allow for. Like, I think all the story beats we get here are fine, but the problem is that they just leave absolutely no room for the necessary connective tissue that a film needs to adequately control things like pace and tone. Probably the most egregious example of this is a cut that we get at the end of a battle scene about halfway through the movie.
So how is it I lost 3 suits and have 2 damaged? Maybe pride does go before the fall.
I couldn't believe it. All this time, I thought he was just an honest baker. Theo's nothing less than a traitor, I tell you.
Now that cut we just saw not only does a bad job of conveying that between those 2 shots, we have now changed locations to a completely different space colony, but also the time span between them is at the very least a few days, if not potentially as much as a few weeks. And unfortunately, this particular issue plagues the overall editing throughout most of F91. In other words, just be prepared that on a first viewing, you're probably going to be asking yourself a lot, wait, when and where is this scene supposed to be taking place again? But in all honesty, as long as you know this going in, I actually think it's pretty easy to forgive most of the pacing issues in this film. But unfortunately, there is another side effect to all this condensing that isn't as easy to overlook, and it's that a lot of the character arcs get a bit too streamlined as well. In particular, I'm talking about the character of Cecily Fairchild. Now, I'm not going to go into too many specifics here, since I've tried to refrain from referencing any direct plot points that fall outside of the first quarter of the film. But as I already told you in the setup, Cecily starts out the film thinking she's just an ordinary girl, no different from anyone else. But then some purple-haired anime boy shows up in a mobile suit claiming to be her brother from a royal family, and her stepdad's there confirming all this, and boy, what a Wednesday, am I right? Now, Cecily is at first understandably unsure about what to do with all this new information about herself, but she eventually agrees to go with her brother once he tells her that the Crossbone Vanguard can help her look for their long-lost mother. The problem is, the movie never actually shows them doing this. Instead, the next scene with Cecily is about how she's not comfortable living the life of a noble and being attended to by servants. And later on we get this scene where she rebukes her grandfather's elitist ideology, but then after that, she seems to have changed almost overnight into a true believer in the cause. Or at the very least, enough of one to get in a mobile suit of her own and play an active role in combat. So yeah, her character arc is just it's all over the place. And to be fair, the triple production of this film did a disservice to basically all of its characters in one way or another. Like, there is a whole cast of intricately designed background characters that very clearly would have played a bigger role in a television show that actually had time to fill out their backstories. But it's still really disappointing that out of our 2 main protagonists, it's the woman who gets the shorter end of the stick here. And I guess the only other thing I'll add here is, if you're gonna get into Gundam, that is unfortunately another trope you're gonna have to make peace with as well. Okay, so I'm well aware that that last section may have just scared you away from watching this movie in the first place. But my final pitch as to why you really should give F91 a chance is, it might actually be a good thing that this isn't a perfect film. Because, hey, Gundam ain't exactly a perfect franchise either. Like, I already mentioned how the initial Mobile Suit Gundam had its series cut short by 9 episodes, which resulted in a very rushed ending that was barely able to hold itself together once the brakes got hit that hard. And while most of the other series didn't go through quite as much turmoil during production, I also remarked earlier that while Gundam is usually pretty good at setting up intriguing ideological conflicts, it's rarely as good at providing satisfying conclusions as well. On top of this, you also have the many alternate universe entries in the franchise, some of which go in some pretty wild directions. So at the end of the day, there are a lot of different words you could use to describe Gundam, but consistent is definitely not one of them. And call me an apologist if you like, but honestly, I think it's better off for it. Do I think F91 is the absolute best that the franchise has to offer? No, probably not. But its shortcomings are also what makes it a pretty perfect sample platter for Gundam, complete with all the highs and all the lows you can expect from a full-fledged series. It's got likable characters, high-quality animation, a story that is admittedly messy but also has a surprising amount of depth to it. I mean, come on, what more could you ask for? Look, the truth is, I can't promise you that if you sit down to watch Mobile Suit Gundam F91, you're going to unquestionably love what you get. But what I can promise you is, if, despite all of its flaws and its rough edges, if you can still manage to find something to latch onto in this film, well then, my friend, I think that officially makes you a Gundam fan. which also means you now have so much more to look forward to. Hey, thanks for making it through to the end of this potentially controversial recommendation. If you do end up watching F91 and enjoy it, well then my recommendation really is to just make the investment and start watching the original Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979. If you want a podcast to listen to along the way, I highly recommend The Great Gundam Project, which is actually how I got back into the franchise a few years ago myself. They currently have over 100 episodes available for just $1 on their Patreon. Just watch 2 episodes of Gundam a night and then listen to the episode of the podcast the next morning. It works great. And speaking of Patreons, I too have a Patreon, and likewise for just a single solitary $1, you get a whole bunch of bonus stuff like early access to videos, monthly Q&As, as well as the occasional bonus video whenever I find the time. And if you don't have $1 to spare, well, a like, a subscribe, or a share with a friend are always free and they help me out a ton as well. Alright, that's all I have for you today, so until next time I'll just say my name's Drew, and you've been watching Select Screen.